Hello, everyone. Hello, Ben.
Hello, Alex. How are you?
Fine, thank you. And I want to, again, just like Ara said, I really want to thank you for this presentation. We often don't, I think at least, we often don't
Mm,
think about reading enough.
mm,
And it's clear you've done a lot of research. There was some wonderful theory in there, which maybe we can talk about more, but also some very practical tips, right? Practical advice for busy teachers.
mm.
So good mix of theory and practice. So thank you ever so much for that. We've got a lot of comments in the chat already, a lot of discussion.
Yeah.
So it would be wonderful if some people are happy to
Mhm.
contribute, to ask or answer questions, just like Ara said with the raise a hand button. Ben, can I ask you a question to get us
Yes, of
started?
course.
It's a
Why
bit more
not?
general, so we're taking
Mhm.
a step back for a moment, but it's one I want to ask you, which is about reading and the ELT classroom, which
Mhm.
is it was one of your decisions
Yeah.
points. My question to you is, why do you think reading is quite often overlooked, a bit neglected as a
Mm.
skill in our classrooms? And why do you think it's kind of relegated to homework sometimes?
I think I would say there's two main reasons for that. Firstly, it's a quiet skill. I think teachers are often quite scared of silence in a classroom. And when you add that to our busy schedules. I mean, maybe you see your learners for 2 hours or 3 hours a week, and you've got so much you've got to get through. Well, having them sitting in silence for 20 minutes, it almost feels like it's wasted time. And it isn't actually, but I think there's that sense of, it's the time could be better used getting them speaking, and they're not being productive. So it's not a worthwhile skill to focus on. So I think that's one side of the coin. And the other is that for learners, it's very often not a priority. Um, so it's not really a sexy language skill, right? Um, so speaking is the thing they want to get good at, and they're always going to say, "Oh, I'm really bad at listening. I want to improve my listening." Um, and reading is often that language skill that is relegated, that learners aren't really interested in developing. They probably think that they can do it in their L1, and therefore, well, L2, I know how to read. I don't need to learn how to read. Um, and well, if your students are not saying it's a priority, and if you then think you haven't got time for it, or time is better spent on something else in the class, I think those two things together explain why teachers often push it to one side and send the reading home, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we often see that with more receptive skills in general, like with listening as well. But I think when you explain that reading has been seen as a passive process, right? Like you had with the jug and
Yeah,
the meaning in the brain. And whereas you're explaining it's actually more a process, right?
yeah,
Which you can
exactly.
lead and help the students through with, then suddenly it becomes more of an almost like an active skill, right? With
Mm,
the interaction with the text and receiving and understanding the
yeah,
information at a deeper level.
precisely. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, mhm.
Mm.
Okay, wonderful. There's still so much discussion in the chat. Please
There is.
feel free. Maybe should we read something out, or should we ask someone to raise a hand with any of these thoughts?
Yeah, there's been some interesting discussion going on in the chat, starting off with Neil
Debate.
asking about skimming and scanning, and if we
Mm.
focus too much on that, and then if the exams sort of require learners to skim and scan, and that means, are we developing learners' reading skills or not? And there's an awful lot more going on in the chat as well. Alex, what do you think about that?
Oh, skimming and scanning versus sort of deeper comprehension.
Mm,
Um, Well, I think all of these skills are genuinely important. I think one of my arguments was at and I was sort of having this discussion with Gabby, is at a lower level. Say you have a student who has to face a text, you know, that's not designed for L2 speakers in the real world. And skimming and scanning, showing that they can actually find the information that they might need in that text, can be really, really encouraging. But certainly, I think the point Neil was making about fuller comprehension, intensive reading in academic texts, maybe more exam-based, was a very good point, that maybe we do over-focus on these sort of skimming and scanning.
Yeah,
what do you think, Ben? Where were you on this?
I'm more with Neil, I think.
Okay.
And because the question that sort of comes into my head is, if we're only using skimming and scanning at lower levels, does that mean then that a learner has to wait until they get to A2 or B1 level before they can try to engage with a text more fully? And I don't know about you, but like I've had times, certainly when I've picked up an academic text and thought, oh, I don't really have time for this, and skimmed through it, and found that actually I don't get it, and I have got to go back and read it intensively to get the full ideas, and picking out essential information still leaves me needing more context, needing more sort of scaffolding to get to it. And I think something I wrote in the chat was about making learners aware that, okay, skimming and scanning is effective up to a point. So you only need to understand the key information now. And then the next stage is understanding a bit more. And then the next stage is bringing in some decoding and looking at grammatical or organizational features in the text, and showing them that there's a process. I think that's where I would stand. Gabby has just put in the chat.
That's a good point. Yes.
Yeah. Why would you only use skimming and scanning at lower levels?
Ooh, I suppose you wouldn't, right? Ben, you're the expert on this. I remember I suggested graded readers for more intensive or detailed reading at lower levels. Again, they can be sort of encouraging. Not that we avoid showing more advanced text to lower levels, but I think to a certain extent, graded readers might be useful, because yes, they need to do more than graded readers, certainly.
Yeah. Graded readers
more than skimming and scanning.
Wonderful. And I think we've also got a huge bank of reading and in our courses already that we often forget about. And that is the texts that they've done before. There's absolutely no reason why a learner, once they've done the reading in Unit 2, oh, we can't do that again. They've read it already. They don't need to read it again. Actually, the texts they've done before almost are a more effective way of developing reading than a more complicated text, because if they've already got some working knowledge of that text and they feel to some extent confident with it, they can go back and read it for another purpose, read it and find 5 examples of reference words and draw those connections in your text, or find some collocations, or find a sentence and write it out and parse the sentence. So just as graded readers are effective, I think reading old texts again is also an effective way of helping learners develop, and it being less daunting for them.
That's a very good point, actually. Why not? Texts are there to be read and reread. And it also, I suppose, if you come a few units later, you might yes, a student might also see their progress. They might see that they actually understood more from the rereading than they did initially. I don't know, that's just a thought. Neil's made a few comments. So he agrees graded readers are wonderful. Text recycling to enable higher level reading skills development. And yeah, we do this much too little. Would you agree with that, Ben? Neil, you're very welcome to raise your hand and join in the discussion.
No, I completely do, and I think it can be very easy. And here I am saying this, sitting in my lovely, comfortable living room. In our classrooms, it's much more complicated to this, but it's very easy to get caught up in the pace of the book, right? Or the pace of the course, and knowing that, okay, you've got X amount of things to get through, and once you've done a text, you move on to the next thing, right? And then the next thing. And you keep pushing forward. Well, actually, learning doesn't work like that. But our course materials assume that it does. And actually, it does take some confidence as a teacher to say, no, I'm not going to go forwards today. I'm going to go back. We're going to recycle. We're going to reuse. But if we are looking at skills development, that is something that that we should be encouraging.
Exactly. Neil does have his hand raised. Please, I don't know if Aris can ask you to unmute, Neil. Please go ahead and share your thoughts.
Can I just say a massive thank you to you both, but also to Gabby for what is an absolutely fascinating discussion. I think what Ben has just said is particularly interesting in terms of trying to kind of integrate our understanding of the development of reading skills. And as you made the point at the very beginning of the session, a very different issue from reading practice, which is something we see so often, but which contributes so little, into a kind of a more of an overarching neuroscientific, evidence-based approach to actually really good quality learning taking place in the classroom. I think I agree with pretty much everything that's been said. Perhaps as a question to you both, one thing that hasn't been discussed much so far is vocabulary. And, you know, some of this suggestion that's coming from evidence-based teaching and learning that, you know, we really should spend a lot more time with vocabulary, both before the students read the text and after they read the text, as strategically to enable them to negotiate meaning better. We know that 95% or more tends to be required for full understanding of a text. And there is new research that perhaps we should pre-teach vocabulary. What are your views, Alex, Ben, in the way in which we handle vocabulary as a way to help better reading skills?
I'll jump in first. Thank you for your question, Neil. And I think that as teachers, that 95% is quite it's very complicated to achieve, because if your text is from a course, from textbook, from course material, from an exam, it's going to contain a lot more unknown words than a text at the learner's actual level. And I think the danger with pre-teaching, and you'll often see it with new teachers, with trainee teachers, is that before you get into the reading text, there's a big chunk of 5-10 minute exercise of lexis out of context that just sort of saps the motivation and the interest from the lesson, from the text. I tend to focus on pre-teaching something that's essential. So if I see there's lexis in the text that they 100% need to get that main idea, to focus on the meaning first and to get that that global meaning from the text, I'll pre-teach it, and then we'll immediately go into some sort of lexis task, working with the new things in the text and giving some sort of airtime to it. That's where I am against pre-teaching, is that it very often leads to just a sort of dead space in the class. Alex, what's your opinion?
Well, I'm encouraged actually, because I find myself post-CELTA each year, I suppose, pre-teaching vocabulary less and less. And I hope that's not laziness. It just feels to me it can take an awful lot of time. It takes some of the interest out from the text. It does feel to an extent quite unnatural, right? And I find that doing less of that, they're looking more at the context of the sentence and the paragraph, and actually practicing those reading skills to understand the unfamiliar vocabulary. But I think, like Ben mentioned, if there is some very important vocabulary, maybe very specific, that beyond reasonable doubt they won't know, and I know might kind of throw them off, then I might focus on those words, but I keep it to a minimum, basically.
I wonder if I'm waxing lyrical here, and I wonder if in an ideal world, like if you look ahead and you see you've got a text coming up next week, is there a way then for you to pull out that lexis and integrate it into your classes leading up to that, so that learners have had that opportunity to see the language and work with it before you then get to that text? It's a lovely idea. Whether that would ever work in practice in our busy teaching schedules, but Neil, have you still got your hand up?
Or maybe we can put the question back to Neil. How do you feel, Neil, about this type of pre-teaching or post-text vocabulary you also talked about?
I'm just posting something into chat.
He's posting something in the chat.
And in answer, actually, I'm not sure. So I've been on the same journey as you, Alex, that, I used to, it was death by pre-teaching, and it killed the lesson. It really did. And the learners simply didn't want to read as a result. However, literally in the last couple of days, I'm seeing reference to work that's looking at better outcomes in terms of processing, where there is more pre-teaching taking place. And I've put the link into the chat box, but I quote, "Results showed that pre-reading instruction plus reading the text led to both more vocabulary learning and a processing advantage," which I think is kind of interesting, because it's going against this idea that we should pre-teach much less. And I think some of the work, what you were talking about, Ben, in terms of central lexis, blocking lexis, Joe Kokonga's idea, that's pretty much where I'm at. I'm wondering whether things are swinging back again. I mean, I don't know.
Thank you as well for the recommendation. It's an interesting study. We do have a question in the Q&A. Hossam, are you happy for me to read your question? It is a question I thought about as well. To what extent, and this is for Ben, to what extent do you think the use of authentic reading materials would be helpful to get the learners more involved in the reading lesson? I suppose you touched on this with the idea of microtexts, taking social media post, comment threads, things like that. But in general, what's your take on this?
I think in general, the more authentic text that you can bring into your classroom, the better. And very often we'll see that the materials that we are given in our course books and so on are far from authentic. And the more authentic reading that you can give your learners, the more effective it'll be. The challenge with it is always finding something that is an appropriate length, an appropriate level, and is sort of fitting the topic that you are trying to teach. Perhaps you want to go the alternative way and find that text first, and then build your lesson around it, and sort of that reading lesson takes on a life of its own, rather than finding a text that fits in with what you're trying to teach. But I would generally say the more authentic material you have, the more motivating it is for the learner, in all senses, not just in developing reading, but in general. I assume, Alex, you'd agree with me.
Oh, absolutely, especially when you're teaching teen learners, for example. If you can find a text that is going to engage them, whether it's the topic or the kind of just the genre, that can be really good, and it can dispel a lot of myths about, oh, we've got a reading lesson, so we're looking at a chapter from a Victorian novel. Not that I hate Victorian novels, I studied literature, so I'm but we have to think about our learners, and as well, just by being authentic, it's a real text, it's from real life, and that in itself can be motivating for students. Ben, I do have a burning question. It's about
please.
Top down versus, kind of the area, top down versus bottom up reading strategies and processing. I notice in the examples that you gave for teachers that you start with top down. And my question is, should we always start with top down processing rather than bottom up processing when we're teaching a reading lesson?
I would say yes. I think, and evidence supports this, that you need to work with meaning first. If you go bottom up first, and you focus on salient features in the text, on grammar, on referencing, whatever, you're almost taking it out of context. Because if the learner has no sense of the global message of the text and the function of it, and so on, it's very difficult for them to then see how that language relates to the text and its purpose. And those top-down skills provide a lot of scaffolding and support for those bottom-up skills. So activating that schemata, not just of the topics. The schemata is the existing knowledge a learner has, both about the topic, but also about the text, and the function of the text, and what language features you might expect to see in it. So an article is going to inform and describe. A review might be recommending or might be persuading. And having that knowledge gives the learner an expectation of the language that they're going to see, which then feeds into the bottom up, right? So yeah, always work on meaning first, always. Because if a learner doesn't understand a text, what's the point in doing anything else with it?
Yes. Yeah. Well, makes sense. Agreed. If you particularly with genre or text specific, if you're about to read a review, it's going to immediately, that schemata is going to be different to a report or the opening of a novel, which can be very useful as you go into reading a text. I don't see any more questions at the moment, or there are definitely comments about authentic versus textbook. I think a lot of people are sold on the idea of authentic. So I will ask another question, if that's okay. And it's about thinking about textbooks, actually, and how reading tasks are typically designed in them. What I've noticed is that top-down reading strategies definitely dominate. whether it's in our classrooms in general, or, you know, thinking about reading exercise and tasks based on text within textbooks. And like you said, this focus isn't enough. So why do you think they dominate so much? And is there any way that you could suggest to a teacher to adapt, you know, if they have to use a textbook, for example, which just had top-down skills, how they could adapt to include bottom-up reading skills?
Yeah, I mean, some newer textbooks are including some bottom-up in there, and you will find it in some of them, but it's by no means widespread. I think I would say the reason for it is textbooks, textbook writers, textbook editors, again, they have a limited amount of space. And I think rarely will you see a text in a textbook, in a course book, that is there simply to develop reading skills. In my experience, it'll either be a reading text that then is used as a linguistic object to introduce your distinct grammar topics for that, for that unit, or it's your reading text that's there to give learners practice of an exam task, an exam, right? And you might, like I say, you might find bottom-up skills somewhere on that page, but you might not. There might be a restriction on the space on that page, and it's not there. And that means that the teacher planning that lesson needs to be aware that there should be some stage between reading the text and getting an idea of its overall meaning and answering the questions. And it's almost as though instead of saying, oh, I've got a reading page, I'll send that home. It's saying, right, I've got a reading page, I'm going to work on the page in the class, and if anything, I'll send the questions home. And it's knowing that we need to bring in 5 to 10 minutes of top down and bottom up together, just 10 minutes working on that together between that first reading and the final task. And that's something that the teacher has to sort of have the confidence to play around with and bring in themselves. I don't think we can rely on the course books bringing that in for us, which of course also requires the teacher to have the confidence to say, oh, I'm going to step outside. Neil has just written the comment. Yes, so with listening, yeah, I completely agree with you, Neil, that the work of Caldwell in particular, and Sheila Thorne as well in listening, is bringing in a lot more awareness of the need to work on bottom-up processing in listening. But reading isn't getting the same focus. And I think it, not wanting to repeat myself, but it's that reading isn't sexy. Reading isn't a priority for learners.
Let's call it the Cinderella skill.
Right,
there you go.
There we go.
Yeah. Neil made another interesting point. Bottom up, and Neil, if you prefer to read this yourself, please feel free. Bottom up processing just won't work if the students have not processed the text for its communicative function. Okay, so the necessity of starting with top-down processing. I think I'm definitely persuaded about that. I don't know about the other participants. Okay, wonderful. Do we have any more questions for Ben? Of course, I have lots of questions, but please do.
Hossam and Gabby are
in discussion about authentic texts.
Yeah.
About adapting authentic texts, which seems like a really good idea. Takes time.
There is that website, isn't there? Newsella. I think I haven't used it in a very long time, but Newsella, I believe, allows you to view news articles in graded forms at elementary, intermediate, and advanced level. I think.
Yes, is this news Ello?
Let me
Or is it definitely Ella?
use. Oh. Right, I'll put the chat in. Of course, it's gone behind a paywall.
Oh, we have a question also from Gabby. While you're finding that, Ben, wouldn't you say though? So this is from Gabby. Wouldn't you say though that bottom-up reading skills is actually language work? I always see bottom-up skills in reading more related to lexis and grammar work than actual reading.
But
that's how I traditionally thought about it as well.
But can we say then that because it's lexis or language work that isn't related to the reading? So I don't think we can really readily assume that that they are sort of. My mind has gone blank. I can't use my language.
No,
but I don't think
to separate them seems false,
yeah.
right?
And they feed in together, and that you need the language ability and the lexical awareness and recognition to be able to read. And I think working on it in the context of a text helps the learner to make that connection, because very often, especially if you're using a course book, learners can see these different areas of language as quite distinct from one another. Like today we've got a reading lesson, tomorrow we've got a grammar lesson. And well, what if that grammar is in the text? What if you're using a noticing task to get the learners to find that target language in the text and find out how it's used? So I think that to an extent, bottom-up skills development is lexis work and language work, but it's about integrating those skills together.
It's a very good point. Yes, and Gabby's in agreement, and I think so is Neil, which is great. If we might get some more questions come up while we're waiting. I'm very interested in what you talk about, and this is related to your current research, I think, in this area, which is during reading tasks. Okay, so we typically think you might pre-teach something, they read it, and then they you've got your questions, and then they discuss. But here you're talking about and you gave that example of during reading, so like stopping some questions and then continuing. What advice would you give to teachers who want to try this, and what are the benefits that you think that or are finding that this brings?
So this comes from work from Grabe and Stoller and also Paul Nation that suggests that in our L1 we have a bank of reading strategies that we use pretty much subconsciously or unconsciously to engage with the text. And it can be setting questions before we read, setting a target, like I'm reading this because I want to find out this. And as you're reading through, thinking, have I found out what I need to know yet? And oh, I have found out, but there's still loads more. So what more questions have I got? And there's about 15 of these strategies. But research suggests that learners reading in L2 cannot automatically access those L1 reading strategies. They have to be promoted to do it. They have to be given support to do it, especially if they are younger or lower level learners. So the idea of these during reading tasks is to break up the reading and to allow the learners a chance to use these strategies while they're reading the task, and just make it more of a reflective and engaging process than just reading as normal. And when I started this research with my learners, the first class I did it with was a group of pre-intermediate pre-teenagers, 11, 12 years old. And just out of interest, I said, right, here's a text. Why are you going to read it? Right? It was an exam task. I didn't give them the questions. But I said, why are you going to read this text? And they all said, well, to get to the end. And it just made me think, well, if that's, are you reading to get to the end, or are you reading to understand? And I think a lot of our learners, especially younger ones, are probably just there reading to get to the end. So stopping the reading halfway through, or a third of the way through, another third, and giving them a different task helps them think about what they've read, how successful they've been at reading it, and sort of reframing their priorities and targets for the next part of the text. And it's interesting, and it seems to be helping them to get more of a comprehension of the text than simply reading through with a few just questions.
Oh, absolutely, I imagine, and also reading more thoughtfully. In fairness to your young learners, they probably aren't asked very often, why are you reading, right? When they're given, I can't remember being asked this as a student, because I've been told to, or I need to get to the end. But certainly you're going to create more thoughtful readers that way. And with these during reading tasks, absolutely get them engaged and being very helpful as well. Okay. Oh, do we have any more questions? We have about 5 more minutes or so, I think.
We do.
So certainly I found it really interesting how you were talking about research that suggests, I think you were talking about predicting and monitoring, so which is top down, that we don't use these skills in second language learning, or when we're reading in our L2, that we do in our first language, our L1. Do you know any more about this research, or can you direct people where to find out more about that? Because it's fascinating.
This is in Grabenstoller in 2018, which is, if you go back, if you're watching the recording, go back and look at my references. That's in there. And another quick activity you can do, if you're doing a during reading, so you stop learners at the end of one paragraph. Okay. I think we're going to wrap up.
No, I think you can finish your thought, Ben, please. Please finish your thought.
Read a paragraph and you just take, say it's got 4 sentences. Well, you take the sentences and split them in half, and you paraphrase them. So you would then have 4 sentences on one side, 4 sentences on the other, sort of sentence halves that you've written in different words. You get learners to read that first paragraph, take the text away, give them the sentences, and they match them together, just to see if they can figure out sort of the cause and effect, the beginning and the end. And that really, and they'll do it, and they think, I think this goes together. And then they want to look at the text again and check it. And it's just helping to see how the sentence structure works and how the text cohesively goes together. And it slows them down. So the aim isn't about getting to the end. The aim is reading and understanding, and then reading more.
And possibly, as a last thought, you could maybe adapt that as a collaborative reading task. I find that very difficult, creating collaborative reading tasks. Students just want to read on their own typically. So I wonder if you could do that. We have one more question. Can you share the reference to your reading research, please? I suppose looking back at the recording, they'll be able to find that list.
Will be there.
And my question about that, actually, if you could recommend one text from your references for very busy teachers, one text where they could really kind of learn a lot about this, or just a good starting point, a good springboard.
I'll give you two.
Okay.
I think.
Thank you.
Neil will tell me that this date is wrong, I'm sure. If you look up, there's an article by Nation, it's on his website, in 1978. Today's teaching, tomorrow's text, I think. Hey, there we are. Thank you, Alice.
Oh, thank you, Aris. That's fantastic.
Thanks, Aris. Have a look at look for Nation 1978. That's a very old article. There's a PDF online, but that has some theoretical preamble and then a few bottom-up activities that you can quite easily adapt to any text. And if you are short on time, check out the guide to this on my website, which is linked up there, which has information on the theory here and all the activities in more depth, but that you can go away and use straight away.
Fantastic.
And it's Grabe Reading in a Second Language, that 2008 is where the during reading idea came from.
Oh, wonderful. And thank you. Yes, we have the links there, full guide to the workshop available, and also some of those key texts as well, those references. And I really like Neil's last comment, which is Nation, whatever the date, is fab. Okay.
Nation is brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. Quite ahead of his time, it seems. So nice to talk with you, Ben, about this. Thank you for answering my question.